in the last 10 years solidifies a general trend over the last 75 years of interpreting the Constitution in a centralized manner.
So the Constitution has been characterized by a centralizing drift towards a statist, homogeneous, and executive-oriented vision of power at the cost of a more decentralized, plural, and distributed vision. Where then does the judiciary continue to play its part?
Well, I mean, so my argument is that by and large, the judiciary has supported this, with a few exceptions, which you can count on the fingers of one hand.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Table Talk. I am Jyotsna. Perhaps never since its inception has the Constitution been such a huge matter of debate, of concern, of a conversation. It has been in our sensibilities, at least for some of us, but lately we're hearing about it all the time. From Rahul Gandhi holding a pocket constitution to rumors that there will be a tinkering of the Constitution, it seems that in the 75th year of the Constitution, there is a new reawakening. It is the flavor of the season.
Which is why the Indian Constitution, A Conversation with Power by Gautam Bhatia, he's an advocate, he's a constitutional expert, he's also been on this show before, is very timely. A book that looks at the history of the Constitution and yet through the lens of power. Congratulations once again, Gautam, for getting out a remarkable piece of work. And thank you for joining me again on the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I'm going to kick this off very quickly. You know, this is an environment where there's so much debate about the Constitution. It's sometimes just an excuse to gravitate into, all kinds of political arguments and debates. Keeping that at the background, and this may sound, a little bit generic to you, but how are the various ways that you've seen the Constitution has been interpreted in the last few years?
I don't think there's been a specific way that it's been interpreted, because the range of cases have been quite it's been quite wide, and so I think that in that way you can't. I mean, the argument I make in the book is that the interpretation of various cases in the last 10 years solidifies a general trend over the last 75 years of interpreting the Constitution in a centralized manner.
Sometimes for writers, Gautam, where they start from and where they end, it's completely different, different from what they had even conceived. While you were writing this book, was there anything that really stood out for you, even though, you're an advocate, you're a constitutional expert, and yet, was there something that surprised you? It's, yourself, booksellers tell me that, the Indian Constitution has never sold out the way it is selling out these days. So there is, it has come back. It has been, in a sense, reinvented into the public imagination.
I mean, the thing is that you always begin with a general idea in mind of what the argument is in this kind of a book. And the argument was that the Constitution, by its design, contains an inbuilt centralizing drift, and the judgments of the court have contributed to that over the years. And as I looked for more and more, as I went through the cases, that impression was solidified, and it was broadly, that trend. Of course, individual judgments surprise you sometimes based on their reasoning and so on. But overall, as I read the more I read, the more it matched my initial impression and belief. So I think in that way, of course, there was constant learning in the process, but there weren't really any great surprises.
When you speak about the centralization of power, so to speak, bending a little bit towards the executive, and it is something that isn't new. Yet, the role of the judiciary, has that got, is there a bigger lens? Is there a bigger spotlight on that role now?
There's always been a focus on the court. Of course, with social media, in a certain sense now, there is a more daily focus on the court. But I think, but there's always been analysis and scrutiny of it's been a central institution in our republic. I think there's always been focus and scrutiny on the court.
And yet, Gautam, you also write about how this was, of course, the Constituent Assembly. The Constitution of India came out at a time where India was tentatively taking steps into a new future. It had lost, it was in that stage where it had to rebuild, and where we are now, there's a lot of debate that goes on about the colonial hangover, removing a lot of what we have from the colonial era, and yet there are certain laws that hold on. Sedition, that are draconian, actually. Would you like to enumerate a little bit on that?
I think there's like one very superficial way in which people talk about the colonial, hangover, which is that certain laws are, continuing on, certain kinds of just, government structures are continuing, and this is an argument used across the spectrum. I think the argument that the book, makes is that you look at it in a much deeper sense. And I make the argument of constitutions being power maps, which are basically constitutions are instruments for creating, channeling, and containing power. And the way a particular constitution does that, you call that its power map. And the argument I make is that what's not changed is the power map from the colonial times to the present day. And I make that argument across various axes of power. So I think that is the sense in which I think there is a continuity of the colonial structures, in that deep sense of how do you envision the way that a constitutional document should look at power. And that is something that has not changed in us.
And yet, it's very easy, right? Hindsight 2020 is what they say. To sit here and to look back at events and kind of put them in a different perspective.
Yeah, no. So I think that's a very fair point, and I think one thing I do in the book is that I try and understand why the Constitution's framers created or were in favor of this centralizing drift. There were a few reasons. For example, Ambedkar, who was in charge of the actual drafting, he strongly believed that the primary source of oppression in India is the local power structures, caste, groups, vested power structures, and he thought that only a centralized structure, which is distant enough from the local, can actually overcome those forms of oppression. For Nehru and Patel, they wanted, a strong center to hold the country together, to present a unified face in international relations. Then there was an economic argument, a single unified market, and so on. So there were many reasons why you would want to have this structure. But I think there are two things. One is that you still critically interrogate those choices. And then again, it's worth remembering that when you're framing a constitution, you're framing it to last for generations. You aren't just framing it to respond to the immediate times. And so I think it's worth asking 75 years on, is that centralizing structure still something you want to have? So that's the question I ask in the book.
And I'm not going to ask you to give too many details because you want to leave something in the book.
No spoilers.
Exactly. So I'm actually tiptoeing around it, Gautam, just letting you say as much as you want to take out, because it's just the start of this new book. You've also studied several key developments, and which you say are not aberrations, or at least things that didn't really happen overnight. Do you want to, say a little bit about that? Let me go to Article 370 for a change.
Yeah.
Let's focus on Jammu and Kashmir. You've spoken a little bit about that on the book, and I want to hear your views.
Substantial part of the book, of the chapter on asymmetric federalism that deals with 370, and I think that one thing that people think is that they think that something spectacular was done on 5th August 2019 when the status of Jammu and Kashmir was revoked effectively. But when you go deep into the history, and I say this both as someone who studied this as a scholar, but also someone who was involved in the Article 370 case challenging the revocation, what you find is that, first of all, the constitutional framers were never very comfortable with this special status. So for them, it was a political compromise. For them, it was something that was extracted from them. They needed to yield or make those concessions, but they weren't comfortable with it. And therefore, from the beginning onwards, there was an attempt to gradually undermine their autonomy. So it wasn't as if the framers believed that autonomy at the state level is a principle, or a normative principle. And the court broadly follows this philosophy, which is the idea is that ultimately the goal is that Jammu and Kashmir should be equivalent to other states. And so you interpret Article 370 over time to move towards that goal. And the formal, complete culmination of that comes with the case. Now, I mean, the argument we made in court, and the argument I believe is true, is that actually there is something more to something like Article 370. It's recognizing that in a diverse country, you should have diverse arrangements for different parts of the country. It's something that you find in federal all over the world. But the argument in the book is that the constitutional framers, politicians, and the courts have all treated the idea of integration as homogeneity, and that's the approach they've taken to the article.
And yet, and your argument is very valid, and it comes at a time where there is also increased questions around federalism per se.
Yeah. I mean, we have, but those are more classical debates. So the present debate about the three languages, a lot of fiscal, debates around fiscal policy, but those debates have been going on from the beginning. That's the more classical federal debate about the distribution of powers between the center and the states across the board. It's not about special status or autonomy of specific regional units. That's a more wide-ranging debate that's been going on for a long time.
The Constitution has been characterized by a centralizing drift towards a statist, homogeneous, and executive-oriented vision of power at the cost of a more decentralized, plural, and distributed vision. Where then does the judiciary continue to play its part?
Well, I mean, so my argument is that by and large, the judiciary has supported this, with a few exceptions, which you can count on the fingers of one hand. The judiciary has, and I call this a constitutional common sense in my opening chapter. The judiciary has also advanced its ideology of centralizing power through its decisions in major cases, which I call inflection point judgments, where there was more than one road possible. It has, by and large, picked the centralizing road. So that's been a consistent trend across 75 years, which is perhaps broken at a couple of instances, but broadly that's been the trend throughout.
In recent years, have you seen any change?
No, in the recent years, in fact, it's almost intensified in certain ways. But it's intensified, but there's no break in that sense. Some people try to argue that there's been a break over the last 10 years. I think there's been no break. In some respects, it's been intensified, but again, in other respects, this is what the court has been doing throughout its history. And there may be a little more attention now because, again, the media landscape has changed. But it's what the court has been doing has been by and large consistent with its history. And of course, so some people, I mean, I saw a couple of reviews of the book that pointed to two judgments about states' mineral rights in the last couple of years, those judgments upheld the state's rights in terms of certain minerals and taxes and so on. But again, if you look at the actual stakes in terms of constitutional design, those were relatively low stakes cases in terms of interpreting the federal structure. And those kinds of judgments we've had across our history. It is when the stakes are really high and there's a key question of federal design involved that you often see the court siding with the center across the years.
There are also the institutions, you speak about the CIC, you speak about the Election Commission. There's the ED that we are constantly hearing about these days. We hear about the CBI. Does the Constitution lack some kind of clarity in which allows these institutions to have become what they are today, which is, extra constitutional in a sense?
Yeah, so this is the argument I make in a chapter of the book called Fourth Branch Institutions. That is to say that the classical constitutional theory talks about three wings of state: legislature, executive, and judiciary. But for a while now, there's an understanding that that's not sufficient. So you have this range of what people call fourth branch institutions: election commissions, anti-corruption commissions, human rights commissions, information commissions, more recently data protection commissions. These are bodies that perform this unique role where they are responsible for overseeing the infrastructure of a particular right or implementation of a particular right. By that I mean, for example, that the right to vote makes no sense without having a full-scale infrastructure, of voting that would instantiate that right. And for that, we need to have a body, which is not the court, it can't be the court, but nor can it be the executive and the legislature because those are interested parties. So you have a body like election commission. These bodies are called integrity institutions in some constitutions, they're called democracy institutions in some constitutions. But the idea is that, for certain rights, right to information, right to vote, other human rights, you need to have overseeing watchdog type bodies. And given that the executive is directly involved and will be a subject of dispute in these cases, they have to have both appointment and operational independence from the executive. That's a very common sense position. The problem is that when the Indian Constitution was drafted, this vocabulary had not yet really come into being, the idea of fourth branch institutions and independence. And also the Indian Constitution is a very executive trusting document. So for example, in the original Constitution, they envisaged Parliament passing a law to deal with the Election Commission, and until that time, the President would appoint the election commissioners. So in that way, I say the argument I make is you have two issues. One is that for most of these bodies, like the Information Commission, they're not constitutionally entrenched. They come by a statute, by ordinary law. A constitution is silent about them. So then they become fragile. But even those that are in the Constitution, the Election Commission, they don't explicitly entrench independence as an idea, which then makes it very hard to secure independence through interpretation or other routes.
Was Indira Gandhi's emergency kind of, the lowest point of flouting the constitution, or do you see any other aberrations as well that, for the common man, we may not be able to interpret?
Indira Gandhi's emergency was the most explicit flouting in the sense that it suspended civil rights and it brought in sweeping amendments, which centralized power to a much greater degree, which were only partially undone by the return of the Janata Party after the elections. So I think in terms of what was explicitly done, it marks the most express departure from constitutional norms. But in terms of otherwise the erosion of constitutional norms, that's can be a much slower incremental process. I don't think you can have one event that really, encapsulates that.
It's not very rare, this testing of waters to kind of, stretch the safeguards under the Constitution that, there's so many rumors about increasingly that we hear about, in the last couple of years.
I think two answers. One is that, so in chapter 1, I use this term called constitutional borderline bowling, which is borrowed from this American term called constitutional hardball. Which basically means that we often think of the judiciary as the only body that interprets the Constitution. That is not true. The legislature and the executive are constantly interpreting the Constitution in their own ways because they are constitutional institutions that have powers and functions and obligations. So they are also involved in the process of interpreting the Constitution. And constitutional borderline bowling, as you can guess from the term, the cricket term, is when any of these actors basically tries to push and test the limits of their powers and see how the others will react. So if the executive is testing its limits, it sees, will the court push back? Will Parliament push back? In our system of Parliament is very weak, so it can't push back. And I think so. One point I make is that whenever you have a strong executive, you will have this borderline bowling where it will always be testing its limits, increasing its powers, seeing if it can get away with more and more, which I think you've seen last 10 years, and you've seen that before Indira Gandhi. You've seen it whenever there's been a strong executive. It's not unique to the last 10 years. And the other thing about tinkering or changing, so I think that for me, one interest, so first of all, a point everyone makes is that the Indian Constitution has been amended 105 times. Or more. I've forgotten the exact number since the origins, and that gives you an average of one and a quarter amendment per year. that's how frequent the amendments have been. Some of them have been far-reaching. In the first 20 years, you had these wide-ranging amendments to land reform, provisions. Indira Gandhi's emergency, massive, far-reaching revisions to the constitution. So, in that sense, I mean, you've had these things going on for a long time. But I think what is interesting to me is that in the previous election, when the opposition parties, one of their points of campaign was that the ruling party wishes to do away with the constitution or make far-reaching changes to it. The response of the ruling party was that we are better defenders of the constitution than you are. So in that sense, both sets of antagonists were basically competing to proclaim their loyalty to the constitution. I think that's very interesting because I think then the question that we should be asking is why is the ruling party, which by all accounts and by its own account, is a centralizing party, why is it so comfortable with the constitution? And the argument I make in the book, which I think may cause some discomfort, is that that's actually because the constitutional structure is quite compatible with a certain kind of centralization, even borderline authoritarian centralization. So I think that's the question that we need to ask, and that's the question I try to ask in the book.
You've also spoken about pluralism. You've spoken about, a title. You've got about the people. Does this, going back to your previous answer, also have something to do with, acceptance of the people, unofficial acceptance? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, well, so I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. And so another point I make in the book, and I have one whole chapter on it, is actually the role of the people. And the argument I make is that the constitution by design excludes any meaningful public involvement with constitutional governance. So the constitution envisages the role of the people as limited to voting in representatives at the time of elections once every, how many years, and that's it. The constitution does not envisage any further role for the people. So unlike other constitutions, other more modern constitutions, where you see a constitutional entrenchment of a right to public participation, you don't have that in the Indian constitution. And again, understandable given the time it was drafted. I can understand that. So I think it's hard to talk about public acceptance without having structures in the constitution that actually allow for the public to have a meaningful say beyond just elections into the ways in which constitutional governance happens on a day-by-day basis.
In your opinion, what is it that the people of India today expect from the constitution? And needless to say, it's very different from when the Constituent Assembly sat down to draft it, just after independence.
Well, I mean, it's hard to, I guess, speak for what what people want. Again, without institutional ways to channel public views. I do think for me, what was interesting was that the centerpiece of the constitutional change debate last summer was the issue of reservations, right? And the argument was that if the ruling party gets more than 400 seats, their first move will be to do away with reservations. And of course, the ruling party denied that. It said that it wasn't going to do that. And so I think that social justice, is really a fundamental plank of the constitutional design. And I think when many people look at the Constitution, they see it as a document that is designed to secure social justice. And I think that is something that perhaps is what people see when they look at or think about the Indian Constitution. And of course, the link between the Constitution and Ambedkar in popular imagination, I think, entrenches that link, because of course for Ambedkar, meaningful social justice was really important.
I see two sides to it now, in the public imagination, Gautam, and correct me if I'm wrong. One side is, holding on to it really strongly, like a rebirth of the Constitution, so to speak. And the other side is using it very superficially.
So one point I make in the book is that we tend to limit our discussion of the Constitution to the rights chapter only. and we don't look at the fundamental questions of how the Constitution actually organizes power, which is really important. And I'll give you one example I'll give you is that look, we and this is something I've seen. So you look at, for example, toppling of state governments, defection, right, anti-defection, and so on. That's one thing. You look at the role of bodies and organs like the CBI and the ED in terms of what they're doing. You look at the role of the UAPA in incarcerating activists and dissidents without trial for a long time. And then look at the ongoing federal, arguments, debates happening. And each of these issues are treated as being standalone issues, right? We treat them as here is a problem and what's happening. And I think one thing in the final chapter I try and link all of these. The point I make is that actually a deep understanding of the Constitution will show you that these are all connected, and the centralizing drift of the Constitution is what unites all these examples, whether it's rights or federalism or parliamentary defections. It comes down to the way the Constitution is designed and the way it's been interpreted. So I think that the really important takeaway that I want to give people who read the book is that let's try and think of the Constitution in those, like you said, non-superficial, like deep terms, trying to understand what it's doing to public power. And is that the kind of vision that we want in a democratic India today?
You've got all these various chapters: federalism, parliamentarianism, pluralism, etc. Which to you, was the biggest revelation when you were writing it?
One revelation was for me that actually the framers of the Constitution were quite contemptuous about Parliament and the opposition. So we think of Nehru as this great parliamentarian, and that Parliament was at its height, in the first 20 years. It's been going down since then. That is actually correct. Parliament was much more active in Nehru's time, and it has been going down since then. But actually, for Nehru, in fact, he always thought of Parliament as just this, this body which would ratify the executive's actions, and that ultimately the real task of developing the nation was with the executive, because the executive could move fast and do things. Parliament was too slow. And so and if you look at present day, I would actually say that in many ways the present philosophy of the ruling party is quite similar. So they, which is a bit of an irony, because they try and put distance between themselves and Nehru. But in terms of a certain view towards the relationship between executive and Parliament, there's actually a lot of overlap between the Nehruvian era and the present era. So I think that was interesting, and this is not just me saying. So you will find evidence of this, like in Nehru's speeches, in the debates, and so on. That they did not actually see Parliament as playing a very meaningful role, or the opposition as having like a big role to play. That was one thing, and the second big, I think, revelation was the people chapter, which is that there were things that were on the table, like right to recall and so on, which they didn't finally take up. But I'd say that actually the most interesting part for me on this question is the penultimate chapter, yesterday's tomorrow, which talks about the various other attempts to frame constitutions, which were undertaken in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and in the 1970s with the emergency ending, but they weren't taken on board. So I call that chapter yesterday's tomorrow, because these were all historical turning points where other visions were possible and were not taken up.
So the Constitution and its pedestal that we speak about, is it as steady as it's ever going to be?
The Constitution it has survived for 75 years. That is 4 times the average length of a constitution in the modern era. 19 years is the average length. So I think clearly it has held together. And for many people, that's a sign of its strength. It's a good thing. And I think that one thing I want to challenge is actually that belief. That if the reason why the Constitution has held is because of the centralizing drift, then we should be also prepared to debate the fundamentals of that Constitution as well, regardless of the time or the place. It's something that should always be up for scrutiny, and placing any human-made document on a pedestal, I think, is dangerous, because humans always have their flaws, and human creations have their flaws, and we should be prepared to discuss those in a free and frank way.
Well, that was a conversation, a very important conversation with Gautam Bhatia. And as you await his book, and go to the bookstores or wherever you get your books for The Indian Constitution, A Conversation with Power, here is a quick check of another book you can get. My book has been out as well, Pratap, a Defiant Newspaper, wherever you get them, across Amazon and wherever you in bookstores. Have a look. It's also historical. It goes way before the Constituent Assembly and still resonates in our present. So Pratap, a Defiant Newspaper, and Indian Constitution, A Conversation with Power, 2 books you could look to get. And have a good day. Thank you for joining.